And who was largely responsible? He said this really quick, you may not have caught it, but it was a particular individual. His name was Alfred Rehwinkel. That's R-E-H-W-I-N-K-E-L, Alfred Rehwinkel. He was a professor at Concordia Seminary in St. Louis. And strangely enough, he actually wrote a book in favor of Planned Parenthood. And I haven't read it. I'm dying to read it. I think it's on my shelf somewhere in my to-do list. But he comes out, and I haven't read it entirely, so I can't tell you exactly what, but I'm told that he basically comes out and supports her ideals. I have a hard time believing that he supported abortion. But everything else, to my knowledge, he comes out and supports in this book. He was the first to do so in a wide arena in the Synod, and it didn't take long for that to begin spreading.
I'm having a little trouble buying that the general population of the United States started to generally accept Sanger's beliefs as early as post-World War II, because that's when we had the largest woman population in U.S. history.
Mm-hmm.
So apparently it wasn't really an instilled family belief in that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting, the baby boom generation started when?
45.
Yeah.
40.
Right after
Okay.
came home from
And ended in
60,
1960.
If you were born
Right.
between 45 and 60, you're a baby boomer.
Okay.
But they probably didn't have the means, you know, even though it was being promoted, it wasn't available, you know.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, abortion, if it existed at that time, and it probably did, was back alley.
It really changed yet.
Uh-huh.
Yeah,
Most
everybody's
more
having
like
big
the
families.
60s,
Yeah.
60s vintage is when I would say that change was really becoming noticeable.
Yeah, I know families, you know, who were having kids in the 20s and 30s, let's say, and interestingly enough, those families tend to be somewhat quite small, and that's, you know, probably because of the economic situation that they faced. What was the mood in the 1940s and 50s? Was it pretty optimistic, you know, after winning the war, and everyone, the country seemed to be going in a good direction?
Right, there was, it got us out of the Depression.
Yeah, soldiers were coming home from the war and being with their wives again after not being home for a while, and so, surprise, surprise.
Jobs and everything, there were jobs available.
Things are going fairly well in the direction of the birth rate, right? And you have to realize that I think you're right, you make a good point, that it wasn't like everyone just suddenly became a Margaret Sanger fan. Yeah. And the country was still largely Christian during this time as well. Evolution had not yet been introduced into public schools as doctrine, and that caused a whole cascade of things, especially from the 1960s onward, that wasn't present yet during the baby boom generation.
Well, evolution was being taught in the 1930s. That's why they had the Scopes trial.
Yeah. But if Kent Hovind is correct, he's a creation scientist in Florida, it wasn't really until the 1960s when it was indoctrinated as it is the only thing to be taught. You know, at least I'm assuming before 1960 it was one of several possibilities, which included creation as well.
So.
I mean, that's the impression that Hovind gave in a presentation I heard. I don't know. I wasn't around then, so I couldn't tell you.
Plus, back in the 20s and things, I mean, people were having big families because back then the United States was 75% rural. They lived on farms and they needed a lot of kids to help with farm work. And it wasn't until, you know, people transitioned to an urban lifestyle after the World War II that you started to see. But again, I don't think there was much of anything about, you know, population getting out of control until the 1960s, and then there was a lot of talk about
fear of the baby boom.
The fear of
what it
overpopulation, that there wouldn't be enough food, but you know, science has a way of helping out. With every mouth that feed comes a spirit, hands to do the work, and a mind to figure out how to grow more food. So
yeah. And that's the next question, actually, that we're right there. Which of Sanger's arguments was most responsible for the LCMS and other evangelical fundamentalist churches changing their course? And that was the overpopulation argument. It was very convincing. to people. And the next question goes along with it. A loss of faith in God's blank characterized American Christianity in its embrace of Sanger and her ideals. Providence. And some people will say, and I hear this from time to time, well, then you shouldn't have health insurance if you believe in God's providence. Okay, you hear that argument. Is your buying health insurance for yourself a lack of faith in God's providence? Well, that argument's about to go out the window because you're going to have it pretty soon.
Well, I mean, I just heard about financial planning on Family Life Radio yesterday. You know, they were talking about a guy was given steps, a Christian, you know, credit counselor or whatever was given steps, a financial planner on how to, you know, use your money wisely and how to prepare for the future, how to, you know, save for your retirement and things like that. So if you just rely on God's providence and he didn't accept that he wants you to, you know, be responsible, I don't think.
But yet God taught to save up for 4 times to go back to Egypt and Joseph and stuff. You do lay in a stock and you tie yourself over the troughs, right? That's good stewardship of what you get in chunks, maybe.
Yeah, and so I want to ask you, you know, and again, just kind of food for thought. You know, does God give his people the opportunity to be stewards over his creation in terms of, you know, does he give his people the ability to tell him when he can and cannot create a life? Maybe that's putting it kind of crassly. Because this goes along with the providence thing, with the overpopulation. Do we fear that God has lost control of this world to the point that if we have a certain number of children, generally speaking, across families, if our birth rate does go up to, let's say, 4 or 5 per family rather than the 1.9 or 2.0, wherever it's at right now, let's say it goes up to 4 or 5 per family, do we fear that God has lost control of this world to the point where, you know, we're all going to die if we have children? Apparently people were buying into this argument that God had lost control of the world, that he was no longer sovereign over creation. And so humans, like they tend to do, took matters into their own hands and decided to fix God's problem for him.
Is that what the Chinese government does then?
Certainly.
Oh.
And it is difficult. You look over in a place like that where
they have to think about whether they can provide jobs, because if they can't provide jobs, they're going to have a revolution. They've done the experiment many times. There's going to be a revolution if they can't keep the people employed.
Yeah.
And you know, also they feel like they did, I think, get pretty lucky on having a green revolution in the 1960s that allowed them to continue to feed everybody. But you know, they're concerned about the amount of arable land they have and their resources, and
Yeah.
So they've tried to put the brakes on it, but the locomotive's very heavy and it's moving forward, momentum.
Yeah.
It's going to be very hard to stop it. But they're not, you know, we do something like that in the United States. I don't know. I mean, obviously, we can't because we're a democracy and they're, you know, authoritarian government.
Right.
But on the other hand, you know, we have authoritarian parts to our government too.
Yeah, I mean, actions have consequences. Controlling the population could be a quick fix. But you know, the funniest thing, it's not funny, it's tragic, is you hear someone say like, boy, if the U.S. had an additional, like, you know, 40 million workers right now, we'd be in pretty good shape economically because of the jobs created and the resources needed. And it's like, well, how many babies have been killed in abortions since
we don't have
COVID?
jobs for anybody right now. There's 12% unemployment. There 9%, excuse me, 9% unemployment.
Right.
So we don't have extra jobs for people right now.
Right, but more people means more jobs, you know, certainly, in terms of the resources needed. The two go hand in hand, actually. It's not necessarily because, it's not necessarily that we have too many people, it's that we have...
Oh, so
we
if we
actually,
had the people, we wouldn't outsource the jobs to China. We'd just keep the jobs here if we had the people.
well,
I think the robots
more
are taking
food,
care of that
more
problem.
cars.
but But you know, we have this huge social security crisis coming up because we have so many people who are retiring and not enough young people to be working for them. It's like, well, that's a problem of our own making. We wiped out 50 million people in our population in the last 38 years.
Yes. Yeah, we had a baby boom and now we don't.
Actions have consequences. There's a short-term fix perhaps to control the population, but in the end, is it actually going to be a good thing? I mean,
nobody really controlled it. It was that people made individual choices about family size.
well, right, yeah, I'm not saying the government ever
standard of
controlled it.
living, and people made choices about that.
Right.
You know, your per capita income is divided by your income and your number of kids in your family, and people made choices about that stuff.
These latter questions weren't terribly important. I do want to talk a little bit about Abby Johnson really quickly, and then share some scripture as well. Abby Johnson had a St. Paul-like conversion experience. She was the director of the Planned Parenthood clinic in Dallas-Fort Worth, I believe, which was the largest Planned Parenthood clinic in the U.S. And she has now become one of the leading voices in the pro-life movement. And she's chronicling in her latest, and I shouldn't say her latest book, her first book called Unplanned, what Planned Parenthood actually stands for. We're hearing for the first time an ex-employee of Planned Parenthood say what really goes on behind closed doors rather than what the public image of Planned Parenthood is. You'll even hear folks like President Obama say that he wants to see abortion safe, legal, and rare, and I believe President Clinton said the same thing back in the 90s. Abortion should be safe, legal, and rare. And we can be like, well, okay, rare, that sounds good. Well, that's what they say, but their actions speak louder than words. And one of the things Abby Johnson demonstrates in her book is that Planned Parenthood is very covetous of increasing the number of abortions it performs because it increases its cash flow to do them. You know, it's irrational to believe that Planned Parenthood would want to decrease the number of abortions, since that's where their income comes from. Partially is doing abortions.
Like any other government agency.
Yeah.
They're not a government agency.
Well, they get $300 million of taxpayer money a year, so yeah. They're involved in the government anyway.
Yeah, there was two ladies in the Wyoming State House of Representatives that were pleading with their legislators to not put government in the doctor's office with her.
Hmm.
They're two Republicans.
Mm-hmm.
They feel that, you know, what the Wyoming legislature was trying to do was, you know, add some counseling and a waiting period and things. You can look it up.
Okay. Sounds interesting. Abby Johnson says that when she worked at Planned Parenthood, the national organization was putting pressure on her there was a quota system where they had to perform this number of abortions per month or per year or whatever, and so it's absolutely ludicrous to believe that Planned Parenthood wants abortion to be rare. That's my point, okay? It actually helps them for it not to be rare from a cash flow basis. Planned Parenthood, you may have heard this, has been exposed in the last week or two.
Right?
There have been undercover stings that people from pro-life organizations have gone in posing as a pimp and a prostitute, saying that there are minors from foreign countries that they brought into the country as young as 13, 14, 15. They want to get them tested for STDs and have abortions done on them if they are pregnant from having intercourse with men. And Planned Parenthood, rather than reporting this felony,